Hello, everybody. My name is Brenda Hawes, and I work at RBH and IBH. RBH is a sister partner and part of IBH. And we're here to talk about understanding the grieving process and tools for coping with loss. I'm so glad that you're joining us today, and we will have a few minutes at the end to put any questions or comments in the chat box, and we'll be keeping an eye on that. So today, just in terms of what we're going to be talking about, is understanding a little bit more about how we define grief. In more recent years, the way it's being conceptualized has considerably changed, and so there may be some updated information that'll be good for you to know about. We're going to talk about the emotional, mental, physical reactions to grief, what that means to find support, and also some of the special circumstances when we're talking about grief, whether it's grief at work, whether it's grief associated with a sudden loss, or how to talk with children about grief. That sometimes raises lots of questions as well. And then we'll move at the end into talking more about tools for coping with grief and loss. And I think one of the things to be thinking about right now, given all of the things that are going on in the world, and especially as we're addressing all the feelings, emotions, reactions related to COVID and this pandemic that we're in the midst of, is that there's a lot of people that are being affected by significant losses associated with connections, with whether it's work, family, friends, just what it's like to meet with colleagues in the lunchroom. So there's lots of grief that we can be thinking about in a bigger context right now too. So let's just review the quote that's on the screen in front of you, because I think that really describes it in a nice little nutshell. Grief is not a disorder, a disease, or a sign of weakness. It is an emotional, physical, mental, and spiritual necessity, the price you pay for love. The only cure for grief is to grieve. And we're going to be talking a lot about that as we move through this presentation. So be thinking for you about kind of how you've thought about grief, how you've defined grief. A lot of times, people respond to grief very differently. Nobody grieves the same, and we'll be talking more about that too as we move through it. And certainly one of the things is that grief is a normal, natural part of living and a consequence of living. And in our Western culture, we don't do a real good job of talking about grief. And a lot of times people will call into the employee assistance program and they'll say, I'm wanting to talk to a counselor because I'm feeling depressed. Well, when it comes right down to it, what they're really feeling is grief and loss and sadness, but they just don't have the words to be able to articulate it. So we'll get into that a little bit more too as we go along. So as I mentioned, the loss and the grief that many people are feeling now associated with COVID and the very significant impacts on the way we're living our lives is, one thing that people might be experiencing right now. Other kinds of losses might be a serious illness or an injury. Typically, we think of grief and loss associated with the death of a loved one or a dear friend or someone that we really care about. Might be a dear and beloved pet. Sometimes there's grief and loss associated with moving, getting a new home, divorce. There's birth of a baby. Sometimes we think, that's a really joyous, beautiful time in a person's life or in a couple's life, but it also means a loss of what was, a loss of what was familiar. Sometimes it's the launching of an adult child, a child moving off to college or moving away from home. Sometimes parents, their identity is kind of wrapped up into who I am as a parent, and when I'm no longer a parent, who am I and what does that mean for me and my life? A couple of other ones could be significant financial stressors and losses, and loss of dear friendships. So there's lots of different kinds of losses that we experience. And the impact is different for everybody. Everybody responds to grief differently, and the time that it takes to process, deal with it, manage it, get some healing from it is different for everybody depending on their own particular circumstances. What I like to say is that the more connected we are to a person that we lose, or the more connected we are and attached to a certain circumstance, the more grief and loss we're going to feel at any given time. And so oftentimes the depth of our grief is directly related to the depth and connection in a relationship. And that's really important to remember, because sometimes people feel like there's something really the matter with them because it's taking them a long time to get over the grief. And sometimes it does take longer depending on, like I say, the depth of that connection. And it may be you're the one that's experienced the loss or the grief, or it may be that someone else is. And you may notice that one person experiences it one way and one person experiences it another. For example, in a couple and in a home, you may see one person that's really busy taking care of business. Maybe they've lost a family member, a parent, and so they're really busy taking care of all the business and making all the funeral arrangements, notifying everybody. So their grief sometimes goes on hold because they're taking care of everything. And then their grief might hit them later. Whereas another person, they hear about the loss and they're immediately feeling all the intense feelings that may go along with it. So it's really important when we're managing grief and dealing and talking about grief that we don't compare ourselves to others, because everybody is so different and everybody grieves differently. Some people are emotional, some people are reactive, some people cry, some people get angry. We all express grief and loss differently, and it's really more about how do we support one another in dealing with that. What we see a lot at the EAP is employers often call in because they've had the death of an employee, and employees are pretty dramatically affected by it. So we talk a lot about the grief process and how people are all responding and touched by grief in such different ways. The other thing that really impacts how we think about grief is depending on how many other stressors we have going on at any given time. So it may be that you've just experienced a loss, or you can think of one that you might have experienced that was really a big deal, but you managed to get through it. Well, let's say that you not only are dealing with a very significant loss of a loved one, or maybe a change at work, but that's the only stressor you have going on. You may not be as dramatically impacted, but if now you've lost a loved one, you're now dealing with the loss of being at work, the loss of the usual job structure and the way you organized your life. Maybe all of a sudden now your kids are home from school and you're working from home and you're taking care of children who are no longer going to school, and there's some financial stressors going on at the same time. Maybe you and a partner or a spouse are at home with the kids. So the more we have going on in our lives at any given time, the more we are going to be impacted by it. And a lot of times the grieving process does really tax both our emotional, our mental, and our physical reactivity. So let's kind of move into a couple of the myths and facts about grief too, because one of the things you'll often hear is, oh, grief should take about a year to process. And it is true that oftentimes that first year can be the most difficult when you think about losing a loved one or a beloved pet or a dear friend, because every holiday and every anniversary is going to bring back some reminders. For example, you have the family, you've lost a parent, and you have the family gathering, and their absence is noticed, whether it's some certain traditions that maybe were honored with that person, certain ways of being, certain ways of connecting. Anniversaries and holidays can be kind of a trigger time when our emotions get stirred up and the memories get stirred up. And truly, what I always say, during the time of loss is may the love, laughter, and fond memories shared remain forever in our hearts. And it is true that that's how people live on with us, as we on birthdays and anniversaries, those special times really remind us of that person and remind us of the connection that we no longer have. So bottom line, there is no set timeline for grief. Everybody's different. Everybody grieves in their own way. Everybody grieves differently. And as I said earlier, it's important to make sure that we're not comparing ourselves with others. Another myth is that people sometimes will believe that moving on with their life means forgetting about your loss. You know, I've worked with people as a counselor here at the EAP and one of the clinical managers. I've talked with people sometimes who don't want to let go, and they don't want to grieve because they are afraid that if they grieve, that they will, it'll mean they'll be letting go of that person, and they don't want to. It's a way that they kind of maintain their attachment to that person. But it is possible to grieve, to release the intense feelings and emotions about that, and still hold that person dear in the heart through some of the significant memories and some of the beauty that's been shared with that person. One of the other myths is I must not be grieving if I don't cry, or if I don't cry, that means I must not be feeling sad. And again, that's one of those things where everybody grieves differently. Some people grieve more silently inside. Some people are more emotional, and they let others know how they're feeling. Just because somebody isn't tearful and isn't crying doesn't mean that they're not experiencing the loss. I used to go out into the workplace quite often when there was a death of an employee, and you would see some people in the workplace who were really emotional and they were crying, and other people who were kind of going about their business. And what's really important to realize is that for some people, they are maybe in a work environment that doesn't feel like a safe place to share emotions. They maybe do that silently or away from, people that they're not as comfortable with, or where they don't trust quite as much. So we can never really know exactly how somebody's feeling. Some people want to be at work and just go about doing their business during a time of loss. Other people, they want people to check in with them. How are you doing? Other people, they say, well, when I need something, I'll let you know. I'll ask for help. So again, everybody's different. And one of the things I often will recommend to people who say, well, how do I support this person, or what do I say to them? Sometimes you can ask, what can I do to best help support you? Is there anything I can do to support you during this time of loss? That can be really helpful and a great show of support. So let's just talk about some of the normal, natural emotions that can accompany loss. For some people, it's going to be really deep, deep sadness. For some people, it's going to be confusion. It's kind of that mental formations of just not thinking quite as clearly. And grief can have that effect on us, because a lot of times experiencing a really significant loss or a really significant change, and a lot of times change can be a significant loss. And with that, we activate our stress response. So when the stress response gets activated, that's going to kick in your fight, flight, freeze, or submit. Those are our normal, natural survival mechanisms. We are wired to protect ourselves from threat. And so we're constantly kind of surveying our environment to see if there's a threat out there. And so sometimes we feel that sense of threat when we experience loss or when we experience grief. And so that can be a lot of different reactions. It could be physical health reactions. It could be, you're starting to have migraine headaches, tension headaches, muscular tension in the neck, the mid-back, the low back. It could be irritable bowel. It could be a heart that's racing. It could be sweaty palms. It could be the mental formations. It could be our focus, our concentration, where we're feeling kind of confused, or our mental clarity isn't there because we're distracted. I'm driving down the freeway and I just missed my exit, and where was my focus then? For other people, it might be in the emotional realm. So that's going to be things like anger. It can be low frustration tolerance. It might be anxiety. Anxiety is future orientation time, thinking and worrying about something in the future. That future is not here yet. It could be depression. And as I was mentioning earlier, sometimes people will really confuse depression with grief and loss because they're similar. Sometimes with grief and loss, there's some lack of energy. There's not the same interest in our usual activities of doing things. Sometimes we're a little dull to the usual joys and pleasures of life. These are normal, natural reactions to grief. And I'll talk at the end about what might be indicating that it's really more leaning towards depression. So again, back to we've got the physical impact, we've got the mental, we've got the emotional, we've got the behavioral. Sometimes that's going to show up as misusing of substance, food, might be excess spending, it might be gambling, kind of our coping mechanisms to deal with some of that grief and loss as a way of kind of taking care of ourselves. And pretty soon, if we rely on it a little too much, then we can it can get a grip on us, and then it's harder to pick up and put down as a coping mechanism. So back to some of the feelings, though, I want to mention also, because sometimes there's some regret or some guilt or some shoulda, woulda, coulda, if only I had done this, if only I had done that. That sometimes is a feeling of betrayal. Sometimes there's that feeling of, how come God did this to me? This is, the love of my life. This is my child. And I feel like, how could this child or this loved one be taken so quickly? So there can be just a whole host of emotions that certainly accompany it. And again, I know we're talking about significant loved ones, but again, it can be pets, it can be the job, it can be the changes with the job. There's just so many ways to be able to be thinking about this as we're kind of going through this presentation. Might be some physical reactions, as I was mentioning earlier. Some of the things I mentioned in the body that can be happening also can be related to our sleep. A lot of times when we've had a significant loss, our sleep is interrupted, and that can contribute to some significant mental health concerns if that goes on for too long of a period of time. And it talks in here about reduced immunity and how our immunity gets impacted by loss and by the grief process is that when we activate our stress response, okay, that's the fight, flight, freeze, or submit that I was mentioning a few minutes ago. What happens is every time our stress response gets activated, we dump adrenaline and cortisol into our system because that's what's helping us outrun the tiger. Our subconscious brain does not know the difference between a worry thought or a grief and loss thought, a stress thought, and the tiger's chasing me. So we dump all this adrenaline and cortisol in our system, and pretty soon then it starts to compromise our immune system. And how that happens is our immune systems are designed to go in and clean up viruses, bacteria, invaders that come into the system, whereas adrenaline and cortisol are naturally occurring hormones in the system. So our immune system has to come in and clean up all that adrenaline and cortisol. It's not designed to do that. So it impacts the immune system because it weakens it. And that's something kind of to be thinking about related to just stress in general as well. So I like this quote here when we talk about some of the reactions. Everyone can master a grief, but he that has it. And so that's sort of the difference between kind of being a witness to it or hearing about it, and I'm the one that's actually experiencing it. The lived experience is very different than what we might be saying in our heads. And I've talked to so many people who they're talking about like anticipatory grief. They're imagining a loved one or maybe even a pet or even a change in a job. But there's this anticipation of what it's going to be like when this loss occurs. So we can think about it in our head and have all these ideas about it, but the mental formation around it is a very different experience than what it's like to actually be in the middle of it, to feel it, to to feel what it's like to not have that person, the place, the situation, the pet be there to be a part of our life. And the other thing that can really affect us too is, the context of it, as I was starting to say. So you might be anticipating it, you might be planning on it, you might have had a chance to say goodbye to somebody. A friend of mine, she's a therapist, and she has a celebration of life ceremonies with the person when they're still living, so that all their loved ones, their family, their work connections can all gather around with that person while they're still living to honor and celebrate that person's life while they're there to hear all the love. And so sometimes that's a planful kind of a situation, whereas other times it just hits and it's tragic, and we didn't have any time to prepare. And so sometimes that shock can really dramatically impact us in a different way than if maybe we were anticipating or planning it, or when it's unexpected. The more losses we've experienced, the more we can sometimes, depending on how much stress we have going on, sometimes a current loss can trigger a former loss. It's been common for me when I've gone out and met with groups and facilitated a grief support group where somebody will say, "Oh, I'm just really struggling and having such a hard time with this person's death. I'm emotional, I'm angry, and I can't really understand why I'm feeling so strongly." And recently I had somebody that said, "Oh, you know what? This is really reminding me of when my dad died 10 years ago." And so sometimes a current loss or a current situation will stir up a past loss that maybe is still asking for some healing, or it's just there because that's just what grief is. It just kind of fits with us. And so sometimes when somebody feels like it's really intense, it's because the two things have gotten merged in together, and you're feeling both of them at the same time. So other things that can certainly impact our reactions and that influence us is, it says on the slide here, the stability at the time of the loss. So as I was saying a minute ago, the more stressors we have going on at any given time, the more likely we're going to be vulnerable to some really intense emotions. And then, of course, there's our support network and the resources. Do we have support? Who are we able to talk to about it? Can we get the kinds of support that we need to kind of navigate this challenging situation? And then coping style. We all cope differently. Some people have a lot of different coping strategies. Others, it's more limited. And so it kind of calls us forward to have to look at how it is that we're coping with the situation. And always grief and loss calls into bearing, what are my coping mechanisms, and are the ones that I have working for me, or do I need to develop some new ones to help me manage this challenging situation? So Elizabeth Kubler Ross is really famous she did a lot of work with death and dying. She worked a lot in her time as a psychiatrist with people who had near-death experiences that came back from the experiences and talked about that was like. But she developed this model that has kind of been a recognized model in the grief field. And it's kind of based on the idea that initially we go through these stages, and that when we go through these stages that we finally get to the point at the end. So it starts out as shock and denial, shock and disbelief and denial. And then it moves into anger. And then from anger, it's the bargaining. Bargaining is where we say, if only this had happened, then this wouldn't have happened. If only this, then maybe the person wouldn't have died. It's the hoping that if I could have done something different, or somebody else could have done something different, then it would have changed the outcome of what happened. And then moving into depression, and then finally into acceptance. And there's been some understanding about this model that we move back and forth between these different stages. And more recently, we've said, It doesn't always look kind of that clean. Sometimes we might go from shock, disbelief, and denial to directly into just depression. Other times it might be the shock, disbelief, and denial moving into bargaining or a temporary acceptance, and then back to anger, when the reality of it, when it really sets in. So this model of transitioning from one to the other and then it's kind of over, we're really starting to understand as we learn more about grief that it's much more complicated than that. And so these are kind of the stages right here: that shock, denial, this can't really be happening. The anger is, whose fault is this? Who can I blame? It's very, very common when we've experienced a certain loss. We feel out of control, and we want to find somebody to blame it on, because if only that person could have done it differently, then this wouldn't have happened. And that's what kind of moves us into the bargaining stage. And the depression is, I don't feel like doing anything, losing interest in the usual activities of daily living, and then acceptance is what it is, accepting that what happened has happened. Now what we're starting to realize is there's kind of another way to look at it. And it's a little bit simpler, and I think it recognizes that it's not quite that linear. And so now it's kind of this three step that it's the shock still. The shock, this disbelief, I can't believe this is really happening. I knew this was happening. I was anticipating it. But now I'm really feeling the feelings that are going along with it. So again, how we think in our head and how we feel in our heart are two very different things, and we can't always just talk our heart out of feeling the feelings that it feels. And really the truth of it is, whenever we have feelings are emotions. Emotion is energy in motion. So what we're being called to do is, when we have a significant loss, is we're being kind of called to respond to that. Sometimes when we don't have an avenue of expression, it can come out sideways. Like, for example, I'm in Portland, Oregon, where we celebrated on May 18th the 40-year anniversary of the eruption of Mount St. Helens. And, we're kind of like that too. Mount St. Helens, this pressure starts in the earth, and that pressure builds and builds and builds. There's nowhere to go, so pretty soon it blows a hole out the top. I know that's a simplified version of it, but we're like that too. So as people, when we have these big losses, this shock, this intense emotion that comes up, we need to have an avenue of releasing the pressure from that, or the intensity of the emotion, so that it doesn't get sort of stored in the body. Sometimes emotion will get stored as physical complaints, when it's really an emotion that's just needing to be given some expression and allowed to be released. So in this model, as we're kind of expanding how we think about Kubler-Ross's model, there's the initial shock, disbelief. I can't really believe this is happening. And then there's just the suffering. There's the pain that goes along with what this loss feels like. And then there's the recovery process. This is how I move through it. This is how I get support. This is how I talk about it with other people. This is how I live with it in the midst of everything that's going on. So, for example, right now, we're in the midst of the COVID pandemic. Our numbers are increasing. More people are sheltering in. Sometimes people are stepping back a step. Thought we were moving forward, and now we're moving back a little bit. And that can be some very significant feelings of loss. So it's a process that we're kind of continually moving through. And there is no typical response. There is no typical way of dealing with it. We are all individuals, and we all deal with it differently. And as I've been saying, we all deal with it differently depending on other significant losses that we've had, as well as what other significant stressors we have going on at any given time. And the thing that I would like for all of you to know, probably more importantly than anything that I am going to say on this webinar, is that if you're having any kind of feelings, just know that that is a normal, natural reaction to grief. And we all have it. We all go through it. And as I was mentioning, we don't do a very good job in our Western culture of really talking about grief, not like other cultures do. So what do I do about it? How do I take care of myself? What do I do when I'm feeling some of these intense emotions that could be related to any one of the different kinds of grief and loss scenarios that we've been talking about? First and foremost, make sure you're taking care of yourself. And that can be taking care of yourself physically, mentally, emotionally, it might be spiritually, it might be whatever it is that works for you. If it's a have to, a should, or a must, it's not likely to be a really good self-care activity. I mean, it is important to do things, that require some level of discipline, but it's also important to make sure you have some ways of taking care of yourself that feel like it's relaxing, that it's enjoyable, it's pleasurable. You gain some feeling of relief from it. And sometimes people will dismiss it. The body will let them know, oh, starting to feel kind of wound up. But it's like, oh, not now, maybe later, maybe later. So when we start to get those clues, those little nudges, we have to answer the call. And it's just like when we fly on an airplane and the flight attendant comes on and gives us the safety message. What they remind us about early on in that presentation is that if we're flying with small children or senior or disabled adults, to make sure we put our oxygen mask on us first. I guess these days it would be changing one mask for another. But anyway, we have to take care of ourselves first and foremost before we can take care of others. Another way to take care of ourselves is to increase our ability to have both self-compassion and our ability to relax. One of the most significant things that I notice in working with people as a counselor is I would say probably 90 to 95% of people have some feeling, some self-judgment about themselves. I don't feel good enough. I don't feel worthy enough. Other people are more important or more intelligent or more this or more that. And so what's really, really important is when we're going through any kind of grief process is that we develop a deep self-compassion. And what that means is that we withhold judgment of ourselves. We withhold judgment of others as well. We treat ourselves the way we would a beloved pet, a beloved family member, a beloved friend. We treat them with the same kindness, generosity, and compassion and care that we would do for them. So if somebody that we knew was having a really, really, really difficult time, what kind of support would you offer up? Probably not judgment. You'd probably offer compassion, caring, kindness. And those are all things that we need to do for ourselves. And there are a couple of things that can really help. When it comes to when we're feeling stressed and needing to relax, the one sure thing, the single best thing we can do to bring down the stress response and activate the parasympathetic response, which is the calming mechanisms, the oxytocin and the other kinds of calming hormones that get released when we move into a state of relaxation, is the breath, through breathing. And it doesn't have to be any special kind of breathing. I mean, sometimes there's the count for, 4 breaths, four breaths in, 4 breaths out. So there's lots of different suggestions out there about breathing, but truly just taking a moment out, just noticing the breath in and the breath out without trying to alter it, without trying to change it or trying to make it be different than what it is sometimes the best thing that we can do to calm down that adrenaline and cortisol that we've just dumped into our system. For other people, it might be doing some yoga, it might be stretching, it might be a creative art, it might be dance, it might be out for a walk, it might be out in nature. Whatever it is that you find helps you most be able to relax. And again, not something that's a should, must, or have to, but something that's a, wow, I really get some pleasure from this. Might be, getting a massage. It might be some body work. Whatever it is, it might be a support group. Lots of different things, lots of different ideas out there. And certainly the EAP can help you come up with some strategies if you're wanting to discuss that. Okay, using and finding support. Speaking of the EAP, continuing to build our connections with others. Now, things are different right now for many people. Some of our usual connections and our ways of relating and connecting with people are different right now. And I can honestly say that at the EAP and taking calls and talking with people all day long, one of the most significant things that I see for people right now is the loss of the usual connections. The loss of usual connections and the way that we're used to relating and connecting by getting together face to face, going out, going to a dinner, going to a bar, going to a ball game, of one sporting event of some kind or another. So we're really being called to kind of step up to other ways of connecting. For some people, it's through Zoom. For some people, it might be a support group that's offered online as opposed to face to face. And sometimes it means phone calls and initiating different ways that you can take care of yourself. Say, for example, you're feeling really isolated at work. What that might mean is that you reach out more to your coworkers via emails or a phone call and a check-in. As we're feeling more disconnected, it is important to look at what do we need and how do we go about finding it for ourselves along the way. All right. And then that support group can be really helpful. There are a lot of different support groups out there that might be available to you. So you can be thinking about that. So like, for example, here in Portland, Oregon, we have a program called the Dougie Center that's for children up to the age of 20, children and young adults up to the age of, I think, 23 or 24. And they specifically have grief groups for kids who have experienced the loss of a parent or a sibling. And so there's all kinds of resources out there, and certainly the EAP is a resource for helping you get connected with those as well. So grief in the workplace is another thing that we see a lot at the EAP. A lot of times employer groups are calling in, HR folks are calling in because they've just lost a significant employee, a coworker, and so we really do like to make sure that people get support and have a chance to talk about it, to normalize it, and give people the opportunity to come together and talk about it. Because one of the things that we find is that the more that people are able to talk about the grief, give it an avenue of expression, but also to realize that other people are going through some of the same feelings, it really helps to normalize it. And a lot of times that's the biggest issue is people feel like, boy, there must be something really the matter with me. I'm feeling this so strongly. And when other people can talk about their experience, it helps normalize it and helps people feel like they have some connections and other people that they can talk to along the way. So there's different things that employers can do when somebody's just lost a beloved family member. While they're out, they can look at the workload, how can they delegate, reassign, and then sometimes it's really helpful when we have an employee who's getting ready to return to work, who's just a really significant losses to remember. Sometimes people need more time away from work. Some people need downtime. Some people need to kind of regroup after a significant loss. Other people who have lost somebody, they just want to get right back, and get right back to work. It gives them something to focus their attention on, gives them a feeling of being useful in some way. So again, that's where we get back to that whole idea that everybody's different. Different people need different things. And one of the things that can be really helpful when somebody returns to work is for a manager, a supervisor to check in with that person to say, okay, you're getting ready to come back to work. What do you need and want from your coworkers? Is there any particular thing that would be most supportive? Some people, they want to come back and they want to be able to talk about it. They want people to check in. Other people want to come back to work and kind of go about doing their business, and they'll initiate that conversation if they want to. One thing to remember, say if it's a coworker that's lost a loved one, they're coming back to work, remember that if everybody in the workplace is going up to them and saying, hi, how you doing? You want to talk about it? That can be kind of overwhelming. You're one person, but if everybody's doing it and that's 20 different people, sometimes that can be challenging. So sometimes asking people, what do you most need and want can be really helpful. A lot of people want to know, how do we support kids? With kids, the most important thing is that we listen. We validate. We validate their experience. And so in a family, let's say a grandparent has died, and the parent of one of the parents, and so the parent is crying and they're sad and they're emotional. And then the child comes up and says, oh, mommy, you're sad. And mommy or daddy says, no, I'm not. Everything's okay. Well, by not being honest with the child about their direct feeling and what the child is seeing, they're teaching the child not to trust themselves, because the child is intuitively knowing and reading and seeing the evidence of how that parent is affected. So it's certainly most appropriate to share, yes, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling angry, I'm really missing so-and-so, because what that does is it also gives your child or the child permission to have their feelings. And that is the best way we can move through the grief process. And so, right now it might be that your child is grieving not going to school. Your child is grieving being away from all their friends and their connections. And so sometimes parents have a tendency to want to talk their child out of their feelings. Oh, it's not that big a deal, or it's all going to get better soon. I mean, great to be reassuring. That's a very important part of the process. But before moving into reassurance, it's really important to acknowledge and validate the feelings and the statements that they're making. And anytime we can connect with somebody about, what they've just said in their words, and also the feeling behind the words, that's going to how a person feels like somebody really gets them, because they heard the words, they understood what they said, and they got what the feeling was behind it. Children take their cues from their adults. The younger the child, the more they intuit. So like, for example, really, really young children, they operate in the world intuitively. They're learning everything through their intuition. So they know all these things that you don't even know that they know yet, because they don't have the cognitive skills or ability to articulate yet. So being a model, expressing your feelings about the loss, normalizing theirs, giving them a chance to talk about theirs, and giving them a chance to, for some kids, it might mean drawing it out. It might mean writing it out. It might be an art project. It might be, there may be a lot of different ways for children of releasing the emotion and the intensity behind it. It might mean making something in that person's honor. So different children, depending on their age and their level of understanding, can handle different kinds of explanation and different ways of processing it as well. Okay, let's move on. So some of the things to kind of keep in mind with when we're talking about children is observe their behavior. Sometimes children show us through their behavior rather than their words. So sometimes when parents are really upset because their child is all of a sudden really angry and has a low frustration tolerance, I say, good. Good that they're letting you know that there's things going on, and they're showing through their emotion, and the expression of that emotion is their way of communicating. So the question isn't what's the matter with them that they're doing this. The question is, what is it that they want me to know? What are they trying to communicate? And finding an avenue to be able to try to come to some clarity and understanding about it. It's really helpful with kids to continue to maintain a routine and some sense of normalcy. As we've moved into kids now being home from school and they're not having their same connections with friends or some big changes there. There can be a tendency to, move into an excess of online, videos and social media. Maintaining some balance and routine around that can be really helpful. And that is challenging for parents at times. I don't want to minimize this, because if you're trying to work and you've got your kids home and you're trying to, be the, that at-home parent as well as a full-time job and coordinating all that, that can really be a significant challenge. So when to start thinking about seeking professional help? So there is a distinction between depression and grief. And depression really is it's a lot of, as I was talking about, anxiety is often future orientation and time thinking. It's worrying about something in the future, and that future isn't here yet. But what we do when we have all those worry thoughts, as I was mentioning, is that we dump all this cortisol and adrenaline into our system. Depression is really more of a reflection into the past. Should have, would have, could have, if only I would have. And so there's oftentimes a lot of self-judgment that comes with that, and definitely a lack of self-compassion that we were talking about earlier. But significant depression is when a person is having disinterest in the usual activities of daily living, the kinds of things that may be motivated or inspired before, a feeling that life just isn't worth living, I just want out of here. Sometimes a person who's depressed has moved into a state of blame. They're blaming themselves for the loss of a loved one and feel like, oh my gosh, it's just that whole shame and blame and judgment that can really wear away at a person's kind of spirit and well-being. Also, sometimes if a person is having thoughts about wanting to hurt themselves, that can be an indication that they've really moved into a state of depression. And also if somebody's misusing substances or any kind of addictions to kind of help with coping, that can be an indicator that it could be helpful to get some support in moving through the process. All righty. All right, so here's just a couple of statements here. And as I read them over, think about which one seems true or which one seems false. So I'm going to read each one, and then you just kind of be thinking, in your own mind, okay, is this seem true or false? So anger is an unusual response to grief. So what do you think about that? Well, that would be false, because anger is a normal, natural reaction to grief and loss. And so, we were just talking a minute ago about kids and the huge changes that have gone on for kids as schools have been shut down at the end of the school year. And so sometimes that's really showing up as lethargy, but it's also and sadness, but it also can be showing up as low frustration tolerance, irritation, could be anger. Those are all normal, natural reactions and responses to grief. Next one, crying can help resolve grief. So I think we've talked about that in detail here, but certainly crying is absolutely one of the ways that can help us move through grief. It doesn't make it go away, but it gives the body an avenue of expression. As I was talking about earlier, when we hold all those feelings and emotions inside, because emotion is energy in motion, it comes out sideways. So that coming out sideways can be physical health issues, mental health issues, emotional, spiritual, relational, or behavioral, can impact us on lots of ways. All righty. Positive events can bring up grief as well as negative ones. So what do you think about that? You think that's true or false? Well, and that's another one of those ones that's absolutely true. It might be holidays, it might be anniversaries, it might be birthdays, it could be any one of a number of different events. It could be a certain time of the year, it could be certain vacations that you take that can be reminders, or what I call triggers. Triggers are something that brings up some of those feelings that might be kind of tucked away. So we all have within us kind of certain things. Carl Jung, a famous psychiatrist, used to call it our shadow. And so the shadow is kind of that part of us that's kind of lurking in the background, but we don't always have conscious awareness to it. So sometimes it's there, and then when we shine the light on it, it brings what's in out in the dark into the light. And that can happen with these different events that can trigger us. So the significant event can trigger something that's sort of hidden or kind of tucked away, or I haven't thought about that for a long time, and now I'm thinking about it, and oh wow, I'm feeling all those intense emotions related to it. So just, I always say that when you feel some level of intense emotion, that's a really positive sign, because it says you're in touch with it, you're feeling it, you're noticing it. The danger zone is when we deny it, when we push it away, when we resist it, because that which we resist persists, and it will come back knocking, and it keeps coming back knocking louder and louder and louder until we answer the call, until we pay attention. All right, so let's just do a little review, and then certainly if you have any questions, you could type it into the chat, and Brenda will, the other Brenda on the call will let me know what those questions are. So just in review, life is full of changes, and goodness knows right now, I'm going to speak for me personally because I can't speak for everybody on the call, but I know that in my life right now, with everything that's been going on, this is certainly one of the most significant change times I've ever experienced in my life. And lots of unexpected things are going on right now. A year ago, I never would have imagined that I would be living in the midst of a pandemic that's impacting us on a global level, that we'd be in the midst of kind of a global racial awakening, that we would be experiencing our schools being shut down and our kids being home, that we would have the number of people working from home. We used to have a lot of people that wanted to work from home, but weren't able to, and companies really weren't embracing it. Now, more and more companies everywhere are embracing the notion of working from home. So things that we maybe never thought would be going on are. And with that comes loss of usual routines, loss of the way we're used to doing things. There's loss and I think about for myself, loss also about knowing what to expect for the future. And so for me, it ends up being a constant reminder of staying focused and grounded in present time. What's in front of me right now? What can I deal with right now? What can I cope with right now? How can I support others right now? What are the new ways that I might want to do it? So as we talk about grief, and we talk about all the changes that many of us are in the midst of, we all experiencing it a little different. We can't just assume that everybody else's way is the same as my way. We all grieve differently, some of us longer and more emotionally, and some of that depends on how many other stressors we have going on at any given time, as we talked about earlier. So those are times when it's really important to be gentle with ourselves, to be compassionate with ourselves, to give ourselves the same kind of love and care that we would to beloved others. Okay, so let's see. Let me kind of go to this. There's some resources that are in the slides. Elizabeth Kubler Ross I talked about earlier. recoverfromgrief.com, support groups by state for children and adults, www.hellogrief.org, help for caregivers and family caregivers. I know a lot of communities have caregiver support groups as well. Handling grief in the workplace, another great resource, helping children understand loss. So there's a lot of information there, and you'll have access to this slide presentation to review that too. And certainly the EAP is a resource for all of this. So if you find that you're just really wanting some extra support, you're wanting to dialogue with somebody about some of the feelings that you have going on, we have some peer support groups that are available through the EAP, along with an individual counseling benefit, along with a host of other work-life balance resources as well that can be a great resource for people. And so if you're feeling a call to get some support, you're feeling that nudge, certainly give a call to the EAP so we can be a support for you along the way. So we've got about 5-6 minutes left. Is there any comments that anybody would like to make or any questions?
Well, thank you, Brenda. This is Brenda Allen. We do have a couple of questions here.
Okay.
So recently, I lost my dad in September after a long fight with cancer. I'm doing okay for the most part, but I'm concerned with my mom. She's not dealing with this well. How can I help her?
All right. So, yeah, that's a big one. Concern for another and another family member. So, the first thing I always say is ask. When in doubt, ask. How can I help? How can I support you? Is there anything that you feel like you're needing or wanting right now? And sometimes, in a lot of communities, there are, through the hospitals and community colleges, there are grief support groups. And so depending on your mom and kind of some people are more outgoing and extroverted, and they find some online support might be more helpful in terms of a group. Other people just want somebody to check in with them from time to time to kind of normalize that. So the first step I would say is ask, how can I help? How can I best support? What would you most need and want from me in supporting you, and not making any assumptions about what your mom might most prefer. And if you need any support from the EAP, we also have adult and elder care resources too that can help with resources in the community.
Okay, thank you, Brenda. The next question. Yeah. My son is leaving in January to go to school in Arizona, and I have a feeling I'm not going to deal with that well. Do you have any recommendations or suggestions with this?
Oh, well, my first recommendation or my first suggestion is that is a normal, natural grieving time for parents. It's one of those things that accompanies with a lot of feelings. It's the whole identity as a parent and kind of letting go, and the safety issues and how far away they're going to be and how we're going to be able to be in communication. And so, being honest with your son and having that conversation. I remember going to the new parent. My daughter went away to college from, left Oregon to go to University of Miami in Miami, Florida. I remember going to the new parent, and if they have the new parent groups, if you're at all going to be accompanying him, they specifically have groups for parents to just talk about that very thing. And I can remember one parent there said, "Yeah, my son called me up last night and wanted to know, if I could bring some food and snacks over to him." And the parent said, I said to him, "Well, what would you do if we weren't here to do that for you?" So it's recognizing that there is a transition time that's happening on both sides of things, and taking care of yourself along the way, letting yourself feel the grief, the sadness, the anger, the "I'm going to miss you," and then setting up, what is going to be the best way for us to remain in communication, and recognizing sometimes that one of you may have a need for more communication than the other, and how do you work out between you, what's gonna work for both of you, because what you want counts, and putting out there what you want, what you need, and asking for what you want, identifying first and then asking for what you want and need in terms of communication is really, really important. And it's definitely okay to ask, because if you don't ask, you'll never know if your son's able to give that to you. And it is a big change. And if there's ways for you to connect with other parents, at the school that he's going to in Arizona, or other people in your community, that kind of support could be really, really, really helpful. And it's another really good example of loss. and loss of who I am as a person, as a parent, my identity is oftentimes, I know certainly for me, my kids are 32 and 35 now, but that was a big change time when they left home. All right, it's 1:00. Did we have anybody else, Brenda, or was that it?
It looks like that's it. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for being here. Thanks for the questions. For those of you that put that out, give us a call. The EAP is available 24/7, 365. There's always a counselor and a resource available to talk to, and we want to be there to support you with any kind of significant losses or any grief experiences you may be having. So, hey, you take good care, and I wish you all the very best in whatever comes next. Bye-bye.